In 2025, we rise with the tide. OEDA, pushing dreams.
Okay, welcome everybody who's joined us for this webinar on navigating tariffs. I'm coming to you live from Ronald Reagan Airport in DC, so if you hear a little background noise, forgive me. We're very excited to have you join us today with an awesome panel. Deb Scherer with One Columbus, who I've known a long time, as well as Mindy McLaughlin, Team NEO, people helping drive international development around the state, as well as some subject matter experts. Dan, how do you pronounce your last name, Dan? I should have asked that. I feel guilty.
It's Ujczo, like the two Utes and my cousin Vinny.
Perfect. Ujczo from Thompson Hine, who is a guru in all things international, and Matt Colyar with Moody's. So a really distinguished panel. We're glad to have you today. So Mark, next slide. Okay, so I am the president and CEO of the Ohio Economic Development Association. We are the 7th largest state association for economic development in the country, with more than 670 members. Our goal is to provide best-in-class training, professional development, events, information, and advocacy to really help escalate, elevate, accelerate, and celebrate economic development around the state. And this is one of the free webinars that we're providing to encourage people to come and sample OEDA. All the other webinars, topical or otherwise, will be free to members, but also at a fee for others. But we're really excited. We have the #1 basic course. I think Mark's going to get to that in education. But we're really here to support you and support the economic development community and those around it. But we are really the go-to resource for advancing your career, your knowledge, your network, and your influence in economic development. Next slide. Okay, so the Ohio Economic Development Institute, we are one of 7 state associations in the country with a formalized education institute. We have we provide one of the 7 certifications at the state level for economic development. Ohio CED, it's the 2nd oldest and considered by many best in class. And you can pursue that with us. We'd be excited to have you. Have about 83 people through that program. Another 20 who are pursuing the capstone, which is the final piece of that. And we have more than 100 people going through our basic course every year. We are excited to announce the first time after a hiatus of about 5 years, we are doing a legislative conference in the spring. There are about 50 spots left. Check us out at OEDA.com events. We will have great speakers. We'll have Bill Reineke talking about Senate Bill 2 and energy. We'll have Majority Whip Nick Santucci there. We'll have Dana Saucier and Christy Klaus from Jobs Ohio. We'll have Lydia Mahalik and Chancellor Mike Duffy of Department of Higher Education, as well as Steve Dakin from Ohio Department of Education and Workforce, and many, many more to talk energy, housing, and workforce development. And we're going to be working on OED's policy for this year. So please join us. It'll be great. It'll be in Columbus. And then upcoming webinar schedule. We're very excited. Everything you want to know about data centers, that is free to all. I think our registration's up to about 160, 170. And then we have our core courses. Finance and incentives coming in March. Business retention and expansion are the first 2 in the year. And those 5 count towards certification, but you can also take those as is. And then the Ohio Basic Economic Development course, great for everyone who has not yet done it to understand 4 intensive days to really get your feet wet in economic development. With that, Mark, I think I'm turning it back over to you. Again, welcome everybody, and thank you, panelists.
Thanks, David, very much. Nice to have everyone with us this morning. I'm Mark Barback. I'm the director of the Ohio Economic Development Institute, and I am in charge of the technology. So if something goes wrong, you can blame it on me. If everything goes right, you can give the credit all to the panelists. We're really pleased to have a great panel with us. A few logistics. Please post your questions in the questions and comments in the chat box. We're going to be monitoring the chat box, and we'll pose questions to the panelists at some point during the presentation. If the question that you post is directly related to something that the panelists may have said, I may interrupt the panelists. If not, we'll make sure that there's time at the end for Q&A. And if there are any questions left over at the end, we'll be sure to respond back to you via email. You will receive an email following the webinar that will include a link to the recording of the webinar. And at a later point, the video will be available on OEDA's YouTube site. Once again, we're really pleased to have a terrific panel with us who can cover all things tariffs. And as we know, this is a little bit of a moving target, so this is actually a perfect time for having this discussion. So with that said, I'm going to pass it on to Deb Scherer, our friend from One Columbus. Deb?
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I just want to go over and level set with everyone before we start. What is a tariff exactly? So let's start with that. Tariffs are taxes that are imposed by one country on goods and services imported from another country. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. In the case that we have recently, the U.S. has announced the possibility of imposing a 25% tariff on goods from Canada, goods from Mexico, 10% tariff on goods from China. Another way to look at it is maybe Mexico determines that they want to impose a tariff on all goods that are coming in from the U.S. So how does it actually work? What's the functionality of it? Tariffs are paid by the importing business to the government of the country where the goods are being imported. They are specific between two countries. They can be levied in multiple ways. The most common way is being levied as a percentage of the value, but it can also be a fixed amount on a good. And then additionally, tariffs can also be rate quotas, which means that after a certain level of imports have been come into a country, they can increase the rates. I put a little chart over on the side of this because I think it's a really good illustration of exactly what I'm trying to describe. If, for example, a Chinese exporter sells a pair of jeans to a U.S. importer for $10, and let's say the U.S. is increasing and putting on a 10% tariff, then the U.S. importer now has to pay the U.S. government $1 because of that 10% that's been levied for the jeans, which means the cost now is $11 to the purchaser or the importer. Let's say then, just to further illustrate, after adding expenses and profits, the jeans are going to be sold for $20. So whereas the importer could have had a profit or had a retail price of $19 before, the retail price is now going to be $20 because they're passing that $1 additional tariff on to the U.S. consumer. That's just a really basic overview of how tariffs work. So from there, I'll pass it back to you, Mark.
Help to press the button. We're pleased to be joined by Matt Colyar from Moody's. And I'll do this pick on my own, so Matt, you don't get charged for it. If any of you are really interested in hearing more from Matt, you should keep your eyes on Moody's Inside Economics podcast, the best podcast there is. Matt, you're on.
Oh man, I don't know what I'm more pleased with. Two perfect pronunciations of my last name, which no one ever gets right, or the plug for the Inside Economics podcast. Both are great to hear. So let me go through my deck here. Everybody can see a big chart about inflation.
Yep.
So I'll give a quick rundown. Let's just think about where the U.S. economy is right now before we start to zero in on specific tariffs, specific areas of the country more vulnerable to specific tariffs. I think it's important to get a good framework of where the U.S. economy stands today. Broadly, starting 2025 with a lot of momentum. Job market's strong. It's slowing pace of hiring, but people aren't getting laid off. If people aren't getting laid off, that means incomes are still in good shape. Incomes are still in good shape. People are spending. The U.S. economy keeps expanding, even if it's at a slightly slower rate. That's generally been the story through 2024. It's been a moderating U.S. economy, but still a really good one. Household balance sheets, corporate balance sheets in good shape. we'll see in the coming weeks. Tomorrow morning, 8:30 Eastern, my time, is the weekly number of people that are filing a jobless claim, and that's become, it's always an important measure. It's got, week to week volatility, but it's the first measure that if, expectations that the labor market is softening, maybe all these federal government employees that are losing their job are now filing, we can get a good sense of scale of how big of a hit to the labor market that is. And that'll be the data point that shows it. So kind of eyes are turning there, which is new for the past few months, but kind of signals this sense that maybe things are softening a bit. So that's the general story with the labor market. But here we're looking at inflation. It's been a bit stickier of late, mostly closing month of 2024, and now we have January's data for 2025. Not as encouraging of a story as we had through 2024. What is going on? Well, first, I'm an optimist. I put my positive spin on it is there are still some good things to think about. I think the Federal Reserve has done a nice job bringing down inflation without any kind of corresponding rise in joblessness. And kind of our main story over the past 2 years has been, as long as housing prices, shelter prices, which have a lot of different measurement stuff, it's not as, maybe as, if you're not focusing on this data, to the third and fourth decimal point, you're not thinking about, you're likely thinking about a more straightforward way than it's actually measured. But how it's measured, as long as shelter prices came in, we'd feel like, okay, inflation can get to where the Federal Reserve needs it to be, that 2% inflation. That story is ongoing, but what's happened since that's kind of muddied the water is goods prices are rising now. And maybe it's just a mismatch of time. We always expected good prices to rise. They're not that high year over year. Used car prices are now positive for the first time in 2 years, but they are rising. And that's changing the story. That's why the Federal Reserve is saying, okay, maybe we should slow the pace of our rate cuts, easing policy. Are we going to make inflation worse? But it's also important to think about it in the context of this webinar, which is, are goods prices rising because, or are they going to continue to rise because of tariffs, as Deb articulated very clearly? You put tariffs on goods cost more. That's inflation. Is that something the Federal Reserve needs to get out ahead of? And is that going to pose a problem in the coming months? And should the Federal Reserve then, kind of sit and wait, which is what they're opting to do? Yes and no. I mean, so goods prices are coming up, and I think automotive market, really interesting place to focus too. You see at the end of Q4, new vehicle sales start to rise quickly, and that's interesting. Borrowing costs have come down a little bit, but there's this general sense, November, December, you see people getting out ahead of car purchasing. So maybe they were going to buy in July, now they're buying earlier because cars, manufacturing of cars, very globalized supply chain, likely to have tariffs slapped on those cars. So let me buy it today because I think it's going to cost more later. That's not a cyclical thing. That's not the kind of thing that's going to send inflation back to where it was in 2022, but it does signal a psychological shift, which is, I think prices are going to be higher later than they are now. And that's really important. That's inflation expectations. That's kind of these buzzwords that you might hear floated around, but it's important because if people expect higher prices, which here's a handful of measures suggesting that they do, they can kind of become self-fulfilling. If I think tariffs are going to cause things to cost more, maybe my annual review comes up and I demand a cost of living adjustment that's a little bit higher because I think it's going to be more expensive to do the things that I'm used to doing. If me and enough of my colleagues do that, then my company has higher labor costs than they expected, and they need to pass that through to consumers. And you get that's a pretty coarse way of describing what's going on, but that's the stickiness, the really hard thing to break when it comes to inflation. So investors, businesses, the Federal Reserve certainly focus very closely on what people say they think prices are going to do. And if you look at different measures here, there is this expectation that inflation is going to rise after expectations were generally coming down and towards where the Federal Reserve wanted to be, around that 2 to 2.5% year-over-year growth. So concerning. I didn't include University of Michigan here, which you may see. They have a survey. They asked people about where they think inflation is going, just like these kind of measures. The one on the left is more what investors are saying, but I don't include it. It's very, very partisan, and Republicans think it's going to be no inflation for the next year or 4 years, and Democrats think it's going to be 7-8%. So it's kind of a noisier one, not as reliable here. I think the fundamentals are the kind of statistical methods behind it, especially when we're talking about investors in the left hand side here, a little bit more reliable. That green line there is more long-term, which is interesting that it stayed flat. That's kind of like where inflation is going to be in 10 years is ostensibly what it's saying. And there, the fact that that stayed grounded, investors believe that the Fed can still do what they need to do, but are they going to need to, is there going to be a bout of inflation in the near term? I think is what that rising blue line is telling us, which is where inflation is expected to be in the next 5 years. These are all reasonable assumptions. This is, maybe a noisier chart, but quickly, this is when the effective tariff rate. So if, okay, we have a 25% tariff or 10% on China, but what if we just did a blanket 10% on everything coming to the United States, all imports coming to the United States, then the effective tariff rate would be 10%. And that increase from, so every percentage point up to that 10% causes a sizable, not huge, not a 1%, not a tit for tat increase in inflation measures, but it does raise prices, and it does it in a few different ways. There's the obvious way that those jeans now cost $1 more. But then there's the downstream effect of everybody that uses aluminum or steel or whatever is being tariffed. All their products are going to rise in terms of their input costs rise, and consumer prices kind of flow through that channel. Domestic production that now has, hey, all the stuff I was competing with, I don't need to compete at that price. I can lift my prices just underneath what the imported price is. So that's another price increase. There's some deflationary effects. People can afford less. If they can afford less, that's less demand. That actually lowers prices marginally. That's that weaker consumer demand, first green bar that you see. There's also the strengthening of the US dollar compared to our trade partners. If the dollar is more, I can afford more. Imports become cheaper. So that moves in the other direction. But in general, what wins the day is the higher cost, the inflationary cost. I think another important and kind of to hark back on inflation expectations, I learned macroeconomics between the financial crisis and COVID, and inflation was kind of like this abstract term, this anachronistic, different era type of thing. It wasn't real. That's not the case anymore. People are accustomed. It doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination to believe that inflation can accelerate quickly. We just went through a bout of really strong inflation, and that's different than the first trade war 7, 8 years ago in Trump's first term. So the inflation expectations are much more sensitive, and I think investors, although not yet, this is largely been a story of really high asset prices. I think there's a sense that maybe our kind of collective optimism, whether it's in any kind of asset prices, but here we're looking at equities, may be headed towards some of a correction. Equity markets have been wobbly of late, but increasing inflation means higher interest rates. It means slower growth. And if those things happen, then asset prices are headed down. That's a tough one to predict. How far down? Is it a 30% correction? Is it a 20% correction? That's not something I'm comfortable putting any kind of forecast on, but that seems, all this inflation expectation talk, all this, the pain of tariffs, the hit to consumer demand, where the channel that'll show up first will be in corporate earnings, lower consumer demand. You start to see weakening consumer demand. You start to see weakening labor market. You will see asset prices like equity markets start to come down pretty sharply. I think that's really important. High income earners, those are the people that have big portfolios. Those are the people that have really experienced strong gains in their net worth, given what asset prices have done. They've also likely homeowners have seen increase in the value of their home. That's expanded their net worth. That's made them more comfortable spending. We can see that through lower savings rates. So people are more comfortable spending at the higher income, the people that have earned or have seen a lot of strong gains, and that's been a real key source of the U.S. economy's strength over the past couple of years. So you start to see a correction in asset prices. Do you see a pretty violent pullback in consumer spending? I think that's a reasonable cause and effect that we could be looking at in the next couple of months. Consumer spending will be closely watched, as it always is, but for the effect of changes in equity markets, changes in asset values may have a more direct connection than it typically does with consumer spending. Chart here, I know I'm probably up against my time here. Most of our revenue comes from our forecast, our global model. We say this is what we think is going to happen for all these countries. Here we're looking at the US, that effective tariff rate that I referenced earlier. What do we think happens? We think that the tariffs starting to be applied now, cause the effective tariff rate in the US. So the average tariff rate applied across all of the things that are imported to the US rises from 2.5-ish%, where it is now, to close to 10% in the next 12 months. That's really high. That's mostly because of tariffs applied to China, which has already begun. We think after that, as whether concessions are made, whether an economic downturn or equity markets really start to start flashing red and showing real signs of stress, the administration starts to react to that. That's not a good signal for them, and things get pulled back quite a bit, and we settle something that world that call that peach salmon type of line that is measuring the effective tariff rate for the U.S. Settles closer to just under 5% longer term. So more trade restrictions than we have today, but not as bad as its peak, which we expect in the next 12 months or so. And that's, again, coming from very high tariffs on Chinese goods imported to the US. Where does that hurt? The relatively straightforward here, the industrial Midwest, like I mentioned, automotives, very globalized supply chains. This is looking at the share of a state's GDP that is the volume of imports to a state as a share of GDP. Not a ton of surprises there. Those are states, for whatever it is that their industrial composition looks like. You could probably guess, just judging on where the darkest states are. Ohio, not as bad as Michigan, not as bad as Indiana. Bad being reliance on imports, but still particularly vulnerable. Here, I throw in Canada. Wasn't a state or a country that we thought was going to be a particularly targeted trade partner, but over the past few weeks, that narrative is shifted. And here, again, you see this is total trade. So total trade with, to and from Canada. What states rely most on that trade relationship? More regional proximity, right over the border. Not so bad to get agricultural products that don't make sense to ship all the way down to Florida. But if you're in the middle of the country, northern and Midwest and Mountain West part of the country, makes more sense there. So Canada's not the only target. We have a trade deficit with Canada when it comes to goods, and that seems to be the primary criterion for trade restrictions, tariffs being placed on a particular country. So a lot to think about here. I work closely with the people on my team that do fiscal policy and do trade policy and work on each tariff threat. I don't envy them because they have to. They're responsible for putting out analysis really quickly, and I can kind of wait for some of their analysis and look at it from that angle. But keeping us busy, and as Mark mentions, it's a moving target right now. But yeah, certainly extremely important. I will pass it back to you, Mark. I'm going to stop sharing. But thank you.
Matt, before we move on to Dan, we've got a question. What are the predictions for the construction industry? Aluminum, steel could all rise and spiral in cost and availability because of tariffs. Other materials that could be affected, timber, which we saw in a drastic way during COVID. Is there any thought about what the impact on the construction industry?
There's also construction is the huge industry employing immigrant labor too. So it's another supply constraint there. Housing prices are really high, and people aren't selling their homes that they already have. So because the higher mortgage rates. So the only way to really meet demand has been new building. So that is not something I have offhand in terms of how many housing starts do we expect over the next 12 months, but it is something we forecast. Those are all headwinds, and they certainly point in the same direction, which is higher construction costs that flow through to higher home prices for the people that lose out the most, which is the people that haven't enjoyed home equity over the past few years. These are first-time home buyers. So an imbalanced housing market with no real good news in sight on that front. But the kind of thing that we forecast pretty explicitly and write a ton about. So if there's follow-ups there, I'm happy to dig up what we have most recently and pass that along.
Great, thanks very much. Now, very happy to move on to Dan Ujczo, who's from Thompson Hine. Dan is is well known for both his expertise and his connections in the profession. So, Dan, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Mark. I am going to go ahead and share a screen here so that we can move at the quick step on this. But it's great to be with Deb and Mindy and David and folks that I know in a long time. I want to thank Matt for not showing the Ann Arbor slide, because we would all have to put a big asterisk on it because we know the data is borrowed, stolen, perhaps one would say. But we'll I'm clearly not over that, by the way. But Deb, can you nod up and down if you can see the slide?
I can see it.
Here. You can? Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
So here's where we are. As many of you know, Thompson Hine is a law firm headquartered in Cleveland. I'm based in the Columbus office, 2 floors up from our friends at JO. Right, I walk by Deb's office every day from my parking lot over at 1 Columbus. We work very closely with Team Neo and Mindy and the team, with DDC, with Reddy, our great friends at RGP, Ohio South. And I'm originally from Warren, so shout out with love to Lake the River. And all of our friends, but also with our local and county EDOs as well. I'm an international trade and transportation lawyer, so a supply chain guy before it was cool to be supply chain. I certainly don't want to suggest in any way we're the cool guys at the law firm. Or even the tax lawyers make fun of the trade lawyers. That's how nerdy we are. But but every so often, and certainly in the last 8-10 years, we've become the popular kids, the cool kids at the lunch table, because of what's been going on in Trump 1.0. The Biden administration really carried forward much of these strategies. And then, as we know, we're seeing a lot of activity here. Let me just give a quick takeaway, maybe taking a step back for a moment as to where we're from and looking at it from an economic development. I've worked with so many of you on projects, whether I'm a Canada-US guy, I'm Canada's honorary consul to Ohio, which reminds me, nothing I say today reflects the views of our clients or Thompson Hine, or certainly not the government of Canada. I'm talking to you from Toronto, clearly in a white room with dark curtains, which maybe explains the mood here in Canada. They're not exactly friendly to Americans these days, but we'll get past this soon, hopefully. But when the Trump administration came in 2016, and anytime we say the T word, not tariffs, but Trump, emotions go flowing one way or the other. I'm not here to endorse any policy or politics. My job is to know what's going on. And what the Trump administration did, really led by our then United States Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer, was really try to rebalance was the term that was being used, global trade. And that was led first by taking a very aggressive approach on things using the existing trade framework that we had. We put tariffs, what are called safeguards under Section 201, on laundry machines. Where was that announced? Whirlpool in Ohio. And so those are very special tariffs in addition to those that Deb mentioned earlier. Then we dusted off some old, this is back in 17 and 18 and 19, we dusted off some old tariff mechanisms that we had. One hadn't been used since 1986, which was Section 232 national security tariffs, where there is that authority that the president has under Section 232 that has now been confirmed by multiple courts. And that was steel and aluminum. And we put tariffs on steel and aluminum around the world. And then every country came to the altar and got exemptions, or the major steel producing countries, with Canada and Mexico right out of the gate. So they have largely been exempt or excluded from the steel and aluminum tariffs. That followed Brazil, Argentina, Australia, the European Union. The Biden administration actually negotiated that deal with the EU. But the price for that is that we've had quotas. We call them alternative arrangements or other types of names, quantitative restrictions, just because we don't like to use the word quotas. But we have set steel and aluminum at the 2017 levels in most instances since those tariffs went on. And for the most part, that's been the lay of the land. And then, of course, we took on China. And there were 3 lists. So most China-sourced goods, except for most consumer products. So pretty much all intermediate goods from China have been subject to tariffs ranging from 7.5%, those are mostly the consumer goods, that's called List 4A, to 25%. That's how we ended the Trump administration. And where that created opportunities, the Trump 1.0, where that created opportunities for economic developers was if those goods were subject to tariffs, a lot of that wanted to be ally shored or near shored back to the United States. but as particularly in critical sectors, critical industries. And we all know the race was for electric vehicles, semiconductors, and a number of the products going into that, as well as driven by in the Biden administration by the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which came with government procurement rules, Build America, Buy America, which frankly, I shouldn't say this as somebody that represents the foreign government, but that's one of the best economic development tools we've had, because a lot of companies are like, we're never going to be able to comply with Build America, Buy America, BABA. We have to set up shop in the United States. And so that's where we saw a lot of construction, HVAC, et cetera, all start locating into the US. And then of course, chips. And I don't think we need to tell that story in Ohio. We all know how chips has impacted. Now what's happened, and then COVID also added an extra layer to that trajectory away from China. COVID also added, because I don't think a lot of people had high on their recruitment, their FDI list of let's go find glove manufacturers, rubber glove. Like that was not really in the lay of the land. But we've now also seen it's not just in critical sectors or strategic sectors. It's, hey, everybody woke up and said, I'm going to the store shelves and I can't find toilet paper, right? I'm going to Kroger, I'm going to Giant Eagle, I'm going to Target if I'm high society. What can I find here? And so that's added a whole other layer of potential economic development opportunities. Now these guys are back again. And what have they done? Here's the list, and I'll just move at the quick step. I'm mindful of the time. As has already been said, we've put 10% tariffs on China already. So when I've been out talking to companies since September and saying, here's what's going to happen if the Trump administration's elected, here's what's going to happen if the Harris administration, and once President Trump was elected, we've been meeting hours every day with clients and doing presentations like this and meeting with trade associations. And just as a sidelight, I know this is a lot of information in a short period of time. Happy to come talk to your boards, happy to come talk to any of your members. We are putting a working group together across the state of companies that are impacted by tariffs so that we can share information. And I'm part of all of that at the national and North American level already. But we can just reach out, LinkedIn, and I'll put my email up at the end. Happy to talk to you. But what most companies have said is either A, this is never going to happen, or, the president's just using this for leverage, or two, we've been through this before and we're ready. Let's be very clear about this. This is much broader in scope than we went through in 2017 through 2020. And two, the president will put on tariffs. Like that is an absolute certainty, because that's the only way we're going to pay for a tax cut. So the president sees tariff revenue as a driver. And so when the president has talked about the External Revenue Service, the reason is right now it's very hard to take tariff money and use that to offset tax cuts and other expenditures. So they have to create a new structure to bring this tariff revenue in. That's why we're talking about an External Revenue Service. So what are the things you need to know right now? And then we'll open it up here to Mindy and then the rest of the gang. Right now, this is already larger. All of those leftover China source goods that were not subject to tariffs last time now have 10%. All of those that were at 7.5% are now 17.5%. All of those are at 25 are now at 30%. And that was been done through a new authority that we didn't use last time, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, which allows the president has to declare a national emergency to put these tariffs on. On day one of this administration, the president declared 2 national emergencies. One was on the southern border. We all know that story. And 2 was on energy. And so what the president did, and to use IEPA, was he tied this to the southern border. This is based on fentanyl and security. China has now retaliated against U.S. energy resources and autos like pickups, agricultural machinery. The takeaway there is, so there now are tariffs on more U.S. exports. The issue there is that is actually seen as a measured response by China. Like China knows there's more coming. And let me be very clear, what has just happened, this is the appetizer that's going on to what will be the main course in early April. So we also put, which was a large hit, was 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and carved out energy resources. The first bucket was 25%. Energy resources from Canada are 10%. Why? Just go to Lima and Toledo. Those refineries there in Lima and Toledo, PBF, Cenovus, Marathon, they all rely on Canadian heavy crude. All of the Midwest relies on crude from Canada. Our refineries are only set up to refine that crude. So some of us were intimately involved with those discussions with the White House. I can tell you it was 25% on the Wednesday. These were announced on a Saturday. Energy resources, that definition is taken out of the national emergency on energy. That second one that I mentioned, and that's at 10% right now. And that includes crude oil, critical minerals, natural gas. It also includes derivative products. And so we'll still wait to see how that's defined. I'm mindful of the time, so I'll move quickly. Those are suspended until March 4th. So we're waiting right now to see if those tariffs will go on next week. So March 4th is the next big date right now. We can talk during the Q&A whether what we think is going to happen there. I'll leave that as a cliffhanger so you don't hang up. And we got to hear Mindy anyway. And then the steel and aluminum tariffs are back on. So basically what we did last time is that we just now have eliminated all of those country exemptions and all of those product exclusions. So steel and steel derivatives were already 25%. But if you were excluded, that's why we haven't been paying that much attention to it. All of those are back on. And we took aluminum from 10 to 25%. But that was just mentioned a moment ago. Steel and aluminum derivatives, that list has gotten larger. And I'll show you the list in just a second. And the big one, which Matt touched on, is the president has a master plan, which is what are called reciprocal tariffs. And that is we're going to go line by line to each country. And if they charge more than we do, they either have to come down to where we are or we're going higher. And that's all scheduled for April. The president has threatened tariffs on other areas. Automotive, like he did last time. Pharmaceuticals, like he did last time. Semiconductors, critical minerals, no surprise there. And just yesterday, copper. All of the new ones the president's talking about, knock on wood, will probably be all pushed till April. And we will see within the next week that we are going to accelerate the review of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. That was already scheduled for July of 2026 per that deal, but we are going to renegotiate that right now instead of waiting another year. I just want to, most importantly, whenever the president's talking about tariffs, all of this is in writing. It's in many places, but the America First Trade Policy Memo that came out on day one, and last Friday, the president put out the America First Investment Policy Memo, which has things like CFIUS review of new projects. So China isn't going to be able to invest in farmland anymore. And all of our outbound investment is in there too. But the president, when he talks, he freestyles, so he often commingles the tariffs. These all fall into three baskets. One is what we call tactical or transactional. That's what we're talking about right now, where the president has an issue that he wants to resolve, and I'm going to use tariffs to get there. The other is the reciprocal tariffs, transitional or transformational. And that's where USMCA, that's where the auto tariffs are. That's where these things that are going to be more long-term, and then China. Nothing is going to get easier with China at this point. And so I think most of us in economic development land have kind of backed off on China compared to where we were pre-COVID or pre-Trump 1.0. It's only going to get worse, is the language there. So just lastly, this is what we've done in the first bucket. You can see, so this is in section 4 of that America First Trade Policy Memo. What's highlighted is what we've already announced. There is a report due April 1st on all the rest. On steel and aluminum, just to give you, I went through the steel and aluminum derivatives just for construction are listed by numbers. I went through and just plugged in some of the names. These are all the things now that are subject to 25% tariffs if these go on March 12th. It's basically everything. So even barbed wire, by the way, is on there, and all automotive tubing. So any automotive tubing that's coming out of any fitting that's aluminum, we use a lot of that in auto, that's all on there too. So the steel and aluminum tariffs have significant implications. And then we talked about the middle basket, just to give you an idea of who's going to get hit by the reciprocal tariffs. Here's who we have deficits. There's almost about 500,000 tariff lines where the other country applies higher and we're lower. This is all by a report done by Peter Navarro last time. Again, all of this is on paper. They've already done all the work. These are the countries that are going to get hit in the reciprocal tariffs. India, China, Vietnam, EU, Thailand, Taiwan, right? So if you have projects that maybe those folks have operation, I can tell you the Indians are beating down the doors right now, trying to say, how do we set up shop in the U.S.? Last point, that's the second time I've said last, is we are, as I said, reopening USMCA almost slipped there and called it NAFTA. The reason why Mexico, with its huge trade deficit, isn't on this list is because if you go reciprocal tariffs, we are zeroed out with Mexico and Canada because of the USMCA. But what we're going to do is we're going to launch the negotiation of the USMCA right now. The president is going to have a list of things that he wants Canada and Mexico to give on, including Chinese investment in Mexico, declaring some companies foreign entities of concern of China in Mexico. So China will not be able to invest in Mexico. Right now, the president's team is meeting with the Mexicans as we speak, asking them to put duties on China-sourced goods like we have in the United States. And we'll see if Mexico does that. And if not, the president's going to blow up USMCA. He can do that with a 6-month notice. And then we don't have zero tariffs. They're going to get whatever all these other countries are going to get on the line item. So Canada and Mexico really have a lot of pressure on them. On the front end, 25% tariffs, 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum, 25 on the border and fentanyl, and on the back end, blow up USMCA and get this. So so what does this do for us? It's actually not great news for the economy. I agree with everything Matt said. Companies are front loading. We won't see the economic impact for a while, frankly, from a lot of the big, except if the steel and aluminum go on. Steel and aluminum can be very disruptive here in a short order. But most of this will happen at the end of Q2, and then we'll start seeing the effects later down the road because lawyers like I and my colleagues are doing a lot of our little tricks right now, and we can talk more about that during the Q&A. But what I do expect is all of those projects that we may have been losing to Mexico, they're going to start looking at the U.S. I can tell you right now, I'm up here in Canada meeting with companies. Food. All the food folks are saying, there's nothing we can do. We got to set up shop in the United States. We have to do some of our processing over there to get country of origin over there. And there are other sectors that we can talk about here as time goes on. I've gone over, I apologize, but it's a lot to cover. Happy to talk with anybody one-on-one, and I'll turn it back to you, Mark, for Mindy. Thank you.
Dan, can I just ask you if you'll cover one small point before
Sure.
we pass it to the next person? Can you talk just for a minute about de minimis and FTZ implications?
Yeah, sure. So de minimis is potentially the most disruptive area that we have right now, which de minimis, as many of you know, we have the $800 rule. So basically, you don't pay customs duty, and you don't declare a lot of the data elements, like what's in it on de minimis shipments. This has been a fight forever and a day. But what has happened is we move big containers of stuff that's full of China-sourced goods with tariffs. We move the containers into our ports, ship those to Mexico or Canada. Those 3L providers will deconsolidate and then send those as $800 packages. So they never pay the tariffs, right? Because what happens is they move in bond. It's like they never entered the US, and then they deconsolidate. And so for folks that Temu and Shein and others, that's their business model. What the president did when he put the 10% tariffs on is he shut that all down for one day. What that would have done is not only subjected all of those to 10%, but all of those that had 7.5% and 25% tariffs that haven't been paying those for the last 3 years, all of a sudden, overnight, that program's over. So that's why a lot of the FedEx and some of the other companies who will remain nameless started sending out invoices that said, now your goods are up 35%. We want deposits. So that is actually something that's been under debate for 4 or 5 years. The Biden administration has a notice and comment out by March 25th anyway, had it. So that issue right there can be huge for us if de minimis goes away. It'll be transformative if it is. But so the president did it for one day, and then like everybody got on the phone and was like, this will shut it down, because the other piece is USCBP doesn't have the mechanisms to collect and inspect all of those packages. So it's a huge issue that's coming down the pike, and we just have to keep an eye on it. It will not happen before April 1, though. So keep that in mind. Thanks.
Okay, now we're really happy to have Deb Scherer and Mindy McLaughlin with us from One Columbus and Team Neo, respectively. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mindy. And Mindy, when you're finished, Deb, you follow right on. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be with you. If you don't know me, I'm Mindy McLaughlin. I'm the Managing Director of Global Business at Team Neo, one of Jobs Ohio's regional partners. And I'm not going to say how many years I've worked with Deb and Dan and Christy and David and all the other folks on this call, but I'm always happy to see you guys when I can. In terms of the perspective from Northeast Ohio, and we make up about 40% of the state's economy. I think if you've been following along in this conversation so far, you're feeling pretty negative about tariffs, and for sure the headwinds are tough. So I'm just going to pile on for a few minutes before I talk about what I think the silver lining to this would be, and then I guess my perspective on what local communities could maybe do about this. And then I'm sure my colleague Deb can fill in the blanks of some of those things as well. So in general, I will tell you that when we up here look at tariffs, we've been through this before, as I think a few of you said, right? We were through the first Trump term where we experienced this, and we saw it affect inflows of foreign direct investment or international investment to our state. We saw it affect the price of imports from other places to the United States, and we saw it affect the ability for our companies to export abroad at the volumes that they wanted to do. So those are probably the three areas where we're going to see, from a company perspective, an impact. And as I think Matt accurately said, the ultimate person who pays for this tariff will be the U.S. consumer. So that's a harsh reality we have to sort of get to know. When we have been polling the companies here in our area so far, we hear a couple of things, and this may be what you will hear in your communities as well. If you are a company who is considered an OEM or an original equipment manufacturer, call it a steel company, an automotive OEM, somebody like that who's at the top of their food chain, they are likely to be basically happy about these tariffs. Because it hopefully for them will eliminate foreign competition that undercuts their pricing. However, the supply chain that goes between that original OEM and all of the tier 1, 2, 3 suppliers that get to that OEM are likely going to be squeezed by these tariffs. So when we see companies who provide steel services, plastics, aluminum, food, all these other kind of commodities that have been talked about before, that's where we're going to see the squeeze. And I would anticipate one of the negative aspects we might see will be consolidations, maybe layoffs, or even closures, depending on how long and how harsh these tariffs last. But that's, of course, if they last and if they're as harsh as we think they are for a longer period of time. Anecdotally, I'll let you know about a trip I recently took with Jobs Ohio and our partners at Ready and DDC, visiting foreign consulates in New York and embassies in DC. All told, we visited 16 of those offices that cover the countries that have most investment in our state. And they told us all basically the same thing when it comes to tariffs. That officially their response is, we're going to wait and see. Dan outlined the calendar here, so I think it's a little bit more than wait and see, but they're saying it's wait and see, that our countries view these tariffs as tactics, that where there could be maybe a negotiation or a deal made. And the official line is they're not really worried yet. But the underlying feeling of those governments, which is going to pass down to those companies that have investments in our area that are here already or may be coming, is that really there's a pretty high level of frustration, anger, anxiety about these tariffs. They are being very careful. These governments are being very careful to not say things publicly about the tariffs. They really don't want additional targets on their back. I mean, Dan has already indicated the Canadians have been out and about on the Hill, specifically working the Hill, trying to get the buy-in from everybody. But they're just trying to be kind of under the radar. So you may not hear publicly too many of these countries or even companies who are at a bigger level saying too much. The last thing I would share is because, at least in my part of Ohio, our international community skews pretty heavily European. I'll just defer to Deb on maybe how the Japanese community feels, but in our community, it's really skews European, and it's important to know that for the 27 member states of the European Union who have lots of investments in our state, it's their governing body, the European Union, who decides their trade policy. And so there won't really be room for individual deals with Germany or France or whoever. It'll probably go through the EU. What does all this mean for our future here? There's really kind of a mixed opinion on how these trade wars might affect the United States in terms of foreign direct investment. It's really, again, going to depend on once these deadlines come, how long those tariffs would last, and if there's going to be any room to offset them. So to give a little history lesson, back in 2016 and 17, when we were going through this, we had the option of sending companies to FTZs or foreign trade zones, already mentioned here. That option to have companies be in a position where they can import a product into a political area that could be designated as a foreign trade zone, and then with some value add adapted to it, can leave that site in a different code, they could avoid this tariff or even reduce the tariff. That provision is not available this time around. So foreign trade zones are going to be off the table, at least at the moment, for these new tariffs. Also, the last time I remember being the flurry of countries getting exemptions, particularly our most allied countries. And this time, those exemptions are for sure going to be eliminated. So not to give you the number in alphabet soup, but these Section 232 tariffs, which is if you remember nothing, Section 232 is maybe what companies are going to be telling you that they're worried about, has off the top of the bat, eliminated these country exemptions for places like Australia, Brazil, Canada, Mexico, EU, Japan, and the UK. Before, those countries, and therefore those companies who were importing here or had foreign direct investment here, would have said, okay, well, we've been covered, we've got an exemption. That's going to be not going to be possible at this point in time. So some of the tools we had the previous time we went through this, not going to be available this time. And so basically, the negative part of this will be that it's breeding sort of uncertainty, a little, anger, frustration at the United States, and sort of the flip-flopping between is it going to happen or not happen, or when is it going to happen, how long is it going to happen, are kind of going to be the headwinds that we're going to have to face as economic development professionals. How do we offset that? How do we augment that? But to get to the silver lining piece, the opportunity that could be for our communities here in Ohio is there's a big chance that it could actually be focused on increased FDI, which a number of people have already said. So whether it's going to be our Canadian neighbors who I think when they see a degree of futility in lobbying their own government or our government to get an exemption for their country, that's, to me, when we're going to see an influx coming in. I think the same would be the case in Europe. We have a pipeline, and my colleagues on the project management side of Team NEO know this acutely. We have a big pipeline of European companies and other parts of the world that would really love to invest in our state, or they tell us they will, but they've had one excuse after another. It was the election, then it was like, what's going to happen next? And now we have a bit of a plan of what's going to happen with these tariffs. And so the question for us will be, at what point do they sort of say, you know what, it's not going to go away. I mean, they have to realize it's not going to go away. They're going to have to realize this is a harsh reality, and then we'll be able to refresh those conversations about investing in our state. And that's really what could be the silver lining for this. And I will end with a little bit of my perspective on what local communities can do. If you are a municipal community or a county, I think you probably have a pretty limited reach of what you can do to really affect this. My advice would be that you sort of double down on your BR&E or business retention and expansion efforts when you talk to companies of any type, to ask them, are you importing? Are you exporting? Are you afraid? Are you feeling you're going to face a tariff? Do you have a plan for that? Just the sort of awareness and asking them of that, of how this may affect them, could be a really useful conversation for you to have. So, for example, they could look at trying to diversify their supply chain to somebody in the US. Or if there is a country that ends up being able to avoid that tariff, perhaps that's going to be an alternative. So that would be, I guess, one thing to do, is have that awareness through visiting your companies and being able to somehow track the amount of companies that, or even the color commentary that they give you. That would be, I think, good information to share through our elected officials, particularly at the federal level, particularly our senators, Marino and Husted, who are the ones who are arguably closest to the top on giving that feedback to our president. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to my colleague, Deb Scherer, to kind of round out our conversation on perspectives. Thank you.
Mindy, thanks. And I echo a lot of what Mindy says. What I will share with you from the Central Ohio perspective, and again, Deb Scherer with One Columbus, so covering the Columbus region, is that when we have discussions with our companies, it's really a mixed bag on whether they see this as a benefit, as a negative, and whether they're prepared or not. So let me give you just some examples of conversations that we've had. I anticipate the automotive sector will be the most impacted here in our communities because we do carry a large portion of that automotive supply chain that is focused on servicing Honda and other OEMs. Those that is truly a global supply chain. And while many of them have prepared in the past for reducing their reliance on China and shifting their supply chain needs out of the Chinese market, much of that has gone to Southeast Asia or Mexico. And so if these tariffs are ultimately put on these locations, they will be heavily impacted. And the margins in the automotive sector are quite small. And so there will certainly be impact there. The contract terms are also longer term. So generally speaking, if you're supporting a particular model, you're going to have that contract over a 5-year period. And the contracts don't always allow for increases from a tariff perspective. It has to be renegotiated on a case-by-case basis. So if you are heavily automotive, I encourage you have the conversation with those companies on what their strategies are moving forward, whether that's passing those costs on as best as they can, whether it's trying to identify U.S. supply chain to support or what it might be. The other thing I will say is, I met with a company yesterday that's not in the automotive supply chain, and their take on it was, we're going to get the tariffs, we're passing it on. So it's not really an impact to us directly. Yes, we have to pay it, but it's not going to impact us because the consumer is going to ultimately pay for it. And then I have had some companies that I've spoken to who have fierce foreign competition in the US, and they're happy that some of these tariffs are going on because it's going to become, they'll become much more competitive in the domestic market when we look at where some of their competitors are shipping from. So it really has been a mixed bag. One of the things I will share with you, Mindy said this already, critically important that as you're going out and you're having the conversations with your local companies, that you're asking the question, what impact might this have? Because it could be also, it's not always negative, it could be a positive impact. Maybe they are going to source more in the US, or maybe they're encouraging part of their supply chain to relocate to the US to support them, which is an opportunity for your communities to maybe bring even more companies in. The other thing I will share with you is our research team utilizes a resource called Import Yeti. That is a free service. You can actually go on there and should be able to go on there and research company specifics. If they're importing via container, you should be able to look at that. And that gives you some idea as to where they're importing from and who that supply chain is. And with that, I think I will pass it back to Mark.
Deb, thanks very much. What we're going to do now, we have a number of questions that that I would like to pose to folks. I'd like to pose the first one to Deb and to Mindy, and that is, Deb, you mentioned one suggestion, and that is be sure to talk to your companies about the impact and about Import Yeti. Are there other recommendations that you have specifically for what economic developers and people who are working their communities should do?
Well, I think some of it, I'll just comment and then pass it to Mindy. First of all, no, try to do your research before you go in, so you know. Having the conversations is important. I think the next question is, what do we do with that information once we have it? One of the things that we have collectively talked about here in the One Columbus office is, how can we get those individuals really connected to those federal individuals who can have maybe a little bit more of a say, or really start to start to understand the impact that it's having directly on our companies. The less that we make people aware of what's happening, the less that they understand the impacts that it has, and they can make the decision on how they're going to advocate or not advocate for change in DC.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I think unless you're a community where you can have somebody full-time looking at these tariffs and doing the research, you probably don't have the bandwidth to really make a science project of it other than doing it through your BR&E. So again, we're going to reiterate that asking that question of your companies and your community is important. And besides the direct hookup to our federal delegation, the other thing I would say is encouraging our companies to go to whoever their trade association is in Washington, D.C. Now, we may have a couple of facilities that are far away from that relationship-wise, because they're a couple layers down from where the U.S. headquarters is or whatever, but it might be a thing that a plant manager and even or a site manager at a smaller facility could, okay, that's a good idea. Let me ask my next layer up if we can share this perspective with our whether their state level trade association, Ohio Steel Council, for example, would be one, or the federal ones in DC, because those are other ways to sort of get the message elevated. But we can't do much about it, this community, in my opinion, in Ohio. It's going to have to be moved on to the federal level to show that companies in our community are being affected, and this particularly when they're affected negatively.
There are strength in numbers.
100%.
Here's a question for Matt. Many of my companies import polymers and polymers and materials from Canadian suppliers. Ignore the phone ringing in the background. I'm sympathetic but powerless. Outside of them lodging a complaint with the local congressional delegation, should I have them contact the consulate? Are they compiling some kind of list of how tariffs are not just causing anxiety north of the border?
This is the ultimate economist move. I'm going to push this to Dan. That's such a better question for somebody that's focusing on the legal aspect of this. I know that there's a lot of people making a lot of noise that tariffs are not good for large swaths of the economy. But to your particular situation, no, I wouldn't have anything particularly fruitful.
Dan?
Yeah,
even
no,
there,
I
sorry.
appreciate that. No, and I think it's a great point. Great. Thanks, Matt. No, just but that certainly is the case. I mean, that's what I do as a trade lawyer every day, is that we're gathering those examples. Seeing if there are any solutions, as Mindy and Deb, I think, expertly touched on, are there ways to use various tools that we do have in the toolkit to mitigate tariffs. Now, as Mindy touched on, things like foreign trade zones, duty drawback, et cetera, because these have been around for so long now, like the Trump administration has caught on to what the tricks are, right? So it is kind of more pure, but really the largest issue right now is to have companies looking. It starts with companies knowing what their bill of materials is actually knowing what they're doing, being able to so their bill of materials usually will not include their customs classification codes unless they're a sophisticated. It depends on how they are with global trade, but most of the bombs that we get don't have that customs classification code, that HS code. And so that's usually our first question. I can't do anything with that until I have it. And I always make this comment, I do all the grocery shopping in our house. I'm a self-checkout guy. So I'm a whiz with, every produce. I can tell you that code for all of them. The PLUs, 4011 is bananas. I think I should go on Prices Right with that, to be honest with you. They should change it from price to that. I'd dominate. But that's the same way it is for customs classification. Every product has that code, and if we don't have it, we can't check out. And so that's what we really need to get there. So companies need to get ready there. Now, usually in the chemical space, they'll know, to your question. And we're working very closely with Jen Klein and the gang at the Ohio Chemistry Technology Council to gather some of these examples and give me and take that information, because we're going to be talking. Mindy mentioned Senator Moreno does have the voice of the president. One of the sponsors of there's 8 co-sponsors of the Reciprocal Tariff Act in Congress right now. One of them is Mike Ruley out of Youngstown or Columbiana County. So, our delegation is very influential. I can tell you, we're talking to the White House on a daily basis right now on the people that are writing some of this stuff. So yeah, absolutely. That's a long-winded answer. Absolutely gather those examples. And just on the Canada US side, yes, the consulate's gathering all that information. Have them reach out to me. Happy to have you. I'm gathering it all. We keep that checklist there, but we're working with OCTC and others will do that. Somebody just put a question in there. I don't want to jump ahead of you, Mark, but it's who are the countries US, Ohio have big trade deficits with? It's China and Mexico. That's who we have big trade deficits with. And I'll leave it to maybe the economic experts on here, but that's who's in the crossfire right now. As we're sitting here, the Mexicans are bringing a whole security delegation over to meet with Secretary Rubio as we speak right now so hopefully resolve this March 4th thing.
So Matt, it's your jump ball. What will the impact of tariffs be, if any, on the federal trade deficit?
Can I throw that one to Dan too, just for the heck of it?
Yeah.
If the first trade war is an indication, which it is, it should be, the trade deficit is lower today than it was when that trade war started. So what's the purpose of trade restrictions? Limiting imports. If imports are lower, exports, you would assume, maybe superficially, that exports stay high, and okay, all of a sudden we get a better balance, because what is a trade deficit? Difference between the two, imports and exports. But what happens with these trade restrictions is that the dollar strengthens, and that makes, and if we hark back to one of my noisy charts, higher tariff rates mean a stronger US dollar. That actually means that if I want to buy something from the EU, it's a little bit cheaper because the relative value of our currencies are it's a stronger US dollar. So that becomes more affordable for me to import. So it kind of offsets some of the intention of the tariff, but at the same time, that means it's harder for the European person to get something from the US. So our export volume goes down too. So in effect, they both lower, and your trade deficit, which is the difference between the two, as I mentioned, that doesn't change. It doesn't have the desired effect. It's possible to get there. I always think the most important question would be, why is there something inherently good about a balanced trade deficit? I think those are more interesting questions. China and Germany both have trade surpluses. I wouldn't trade the US economy for either of those. We're just, compositionally, we make and produce a lot of services. Services are, certainly exportable, tradable, but they're more of a domestic activity. We have to bring in a lot of the goods that we use, and that leads to a trade deficit, but I don't see an obvious bad thing there. So no, it doesn't improve the trade deficit. 2, is that necessarily an desirable outcome for the US economy?
Thanks. Next question. Are there any supply chain assistance services available through the state or through industry associations? A lot of silence there.
Well, I don't think they're there yet, and because the tariffs have not come into play. And so we haven't seen any mitigation measures. I will tell you that, that is the debate that's happening here in Canada right now is, and in fact, it's creating this unique situation where companies that have cross-border operations, like if I go to them and say, what's the impact, to make the case to the US that the US is going to be hurt, I want to know what the impact is on their jobs in the United States, right? How many people are going to get laid off in Findlay, right? Or pick your place. And I'm not picking on Findlay, by the way. I love Findlay, but what the Canadian companies will say to me is, no, we're pushing all the bad news to the Canadian side because we want to then go to the federal Canadian government and say we want some subsidy measures for that. So there's an interesting dynamic playing out there. But I think that the trajectory that we will likely be on is we will see relief to farm country if we put the tariffs on. You know, the Trump administration, it's already kind of budgeted for, and we did it last time. Because what will happen is if we go hard on China and Mexico, they buy a lot of our ag products, right? So, as do other countries around the world. So you have to take care of farm country. So that'll help a significant part of the Ohio economy. And then what we will see, Mindy touched on this, we won't see exclusions right out of the gate, but we will down the road. Because at some point, Congress is going to have to step in here, particularly when they only have a 2 to 5 vote majority, depending on what day of the week it is in the House. And so Congress has kind of given the president a honeymoon for the last month and change, but this is going to get really active at that point, right? The House just passed their bill last night on the budget. So none of this, and by the way, while we're all talking trade, what I keep telling people to focus on is, yes, there's all the trade stuff. That's what I do. But all of this is also tied to the tax cuts and the House reconciliation bill. Because when you talk to the White House, that is what they'll tell you. Is like, yes, we know this is going to raise costs. Yes, we know this may be inflationary. Yes, we know. Don't come to us and tell us this. But you haven't seen what we're doing on the carrot side of the equation. You haven't seen we're going to give all of these companies tax cuts. We're going to give them all streamlined regulation, et cetera. And that's what's going on in the C-suites right now. The C-suites are saying we're not sticking our head out to oppose these tariffs yet. A, we don't want to be on Truth Social and on Twitter or X by the end of the night and feel that political flashback. But also, we still have to do the calculation. Maybe it's worth paying 10% tariffs if that's going to get me an extension on the tax cuts, or if that's going to get me other regulatory and I'm going to get my pipeline built or something else, or a project approved that I otherwise was not. So that's where we're still there. So it's two sides of the coin, right? There's the stick side, which is the tariffs, but there's also the economic stimulus side. I tend to think that later part is going to be delayed in Congress, particularly if you're talking about having to make cuts to Medicaid. So all of a sudden you can have a lot of tariffs going on, but you're not giving the benefit. And that's where Matt is going to have to update a lot of those charts, I think, is if we don't have any of that stuff coming, right? So, or they could update the other way. Let's say they actually, pull an ace out of the hole and they're able to get these tax cuts through in the first 100 days. Dear God, I think that changes the math on a lot of this stuff as well.
Okay, next question. What is the best agency to petition to get a material added to the energy resource list?
That's you, Dan.
Yeah, well, we were very active in getting. I want to be very careful how I say this because it is an active project in the attorney-client relationship, but we were very, very active in helping that language be in the executive order. And I can tell you right now, it is still undefined as to what energy resources is in terms of the HS codes. I'm happy to talk offline with anybody that wants to shape that, but that will ultimately be defined when the order goes on, putting tariffs on. Let's hope we don't see that one. And I suspect we may not on the border and fentanyl, but the CBP will ultimately make that decision, to your question. So the president will identify a broad class, and that is to be defined by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So, but I will tell you this, if you want something on that list, you got to do it now, because those discussions are happening hot and heavy right now.
Okay. We've had a couple of questions concerning the further information on the impact of the construction industry. Does anyone think that the industry might tank in the coming years?
Speaking nationally, tank is probably too strong of a word. There's a lot of people in my generation, prime home buying years. There's a pretty high floor under demand for homes. We've seen that, mortgage rates 7%, and people were still buying homes quickly. Any measure of affordability you can look at is through the roof, lack of affordability. So there is demand there. If you have kid 2 and kid 3 is coming, you just need a home, and people aren't selling. So there is a unmet demand. We have a housing shortage in the US. So do things become any less unaffordable, or is there any kind of improvement on that front? Probably not. But to think that the housing market would tank, you're probably looking more at flat price growth, maybe as we've seen throughout different regions, different pockets, the U.S. that have seen really hot growth in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. Maybe there's a normalization there and a correction, but it's not 2008. People have a ton of equity in their home, very low mortgage rates that they've locked in for a long time, to be on the outside of it, not to have enjoyed that home, the equity over the past few years, and having to, you know, pony up the down payment. That's a really difficult place to be in, but that's not the impetus for a tank or a financial crisis or any of the things that we're likely familiar with. It's more of a just very difficult and frustrating position to be in if you don't own that home. But the industry writ large is still just really tight because of a national housing shortage.
I have another comment that let me just throw out there and ask Deb to start with, and that is, aren't we the consumers, aren't we the ones who are going to wind up paying?
I'm going to say that the answer to that is it depends. So if you're a consumer and you're importing directly from a foreign country that has a tariff assessed on it, yes, you're going to pay that. If you are purchasing a product at a grocery store or a Target or somewhere like that, it depends. It depends on whether the importer of record on that particular product or the assembler final production location is going to pass those costs on to you. I would say 99% of the case, they're not going to eat the cost. They're going to pass it on to you. I also wanted to piggyback off just something that was brought up earlier on the ability for, you know, the corporates who may go, well, maybe the tax cuts are better for us and we don't do it. You know, we're not going to stick our neck out and argue about the tariffs. I would say prices will likely go up if they're paying the tariffs. They may realize that the tax cuts are better for them, but very similar to what happened during COVID when we saw prices increase, those prices never came back down. So if the prices are raised, they're going to stick.
Well, there's also the related point, I think, too, is in theory, this works, that if you put the tariffs on and then give the carrot side of the equation, the tax cuts, but do those tax cuts get put into the economy through new investment, through higher wages, et cetera, or do they just get paid out to shareholders and profits, you know, or to bonuses, right? And things like that, which will not have, and you can maybe, I'll leave it to the economists, right? Maybe paying out a bonus to our executives creates some, you know, demand, or creates some buying power. They'll go out and buy some new Ferraris or something, but I'm not sure that's going to help the folks in a lot of our communities, right? So at some point, you know, there's going to have, you'd have to see that actually start impacting wages, and wages go up to see that impact in our communities. And that's the part that I think is a wild card, is is whether this unleashing everything you talk, when you hear from the White House, you see it in executive orders, et cetera, unleashing America's energy supply, unleashing the way that we're going to deal with inflation is just, we're going to make more stuff and create more stuff. Well, okay, do we have the horses in the stable, to Matt's earlier point, like, because you're also kicking a heck of a lot of people out of the country right now that do a lot of that work. And then do we really see that benefit come across the board? And the reality is, we don't know the answer to that yet. And we never got the only real case study we have, Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the real only case study we ever have of tariffs actually going on of the scale that we're talking about was in that 2018 to 2020 period. And it's kind of testing the economist theory, but then COVID came, and we don't know what was related to COVID and what was related to the tariffs, right? So we don't know where this is all going. I mean, which makes it easy for us lawyers and economists. We can say, oh, well, we didn't know, like nobody knew, but the economists, that we get blamed though as lawyers. The economists, they get to just write the next article. But
it's the beauty of COVID, if there is such a thing. It's like, well, we had these predictions and it would have came right, but COVID, of course, jumbled everything.
On the one hand, on the other hand,
I try very hard. That's halfway out of my mouth a lot of times, and I'm like, I can't say that. I think scale is very important here too. Even the most generous calculation for tariffs, say, import levels stay the same. We'll slap on this 10 to 25% tariff and import levels stay the same. What does that actually do for tax revenue? I think that should not be overstated. And I think the idea of holding import volume level is nonsensical, because they become more expensive, or people are just going to buy less of those things. So what we import into the country will fall if we apply tariffs. And even if it didn't fall, it's not the kind of revenue boost that would offset a lot of the other tax stuff, put the cuts forward. Like, we're not talking about the same scale. And then I think the most frustrating part about that is, okay, if import volume did stay high, that means we're meeting our needs and we don't need to invest in the US jobs. I mean, so you can't have both is more the argument. If you're so that kind of gets lost. It's, hey, we're going to get all this tax revenue from imports, from the tariffs, and also we're going to revitalize in the U.S. industry. And it's like, well, you can't get both in a sense. I think that gets double counted in a lot of ways. And if it comes to something like, the fiscal deficit, which is, should be and is focused on a lot, I think the implications there should probably be the center of that conversation. And yeah, not a good outlook.
David?
Yeah, I have a question for Mindy and Deb, and of course, it's Matt Dan have responsibilities as well. So a number of economic development organizations around the state have been engaged with FDI attraction for a long time. You talked about the need to double down on BR&E. I think that makes a lot of sense, but I guess I would think it might be interesting if you have recommendations on how to approach FDI in this era in terms of attraction, like keep doing what you've been doing. Or do you put more time into BR&E and maybe less, maybe not on that trade show that you traditionally done? Or do you recommend investing more time and effort into FDI attraction? And if you recommend more or less, do you have any specific recommendations on tactics?
I'll get the ball rolling, maybe, Deb. Okay. So I guess in terms of our advice, I mean, I do think you're heavy. As a community EDO, you really want to be focused on BR&E as your first stop. It's, visiting companies or talking to companies in your community about these challenges will always be the most time and cost efficient way to do this. As it relates to FDI, Deb will give you her opinion, but I feel like we're going to double down on this in terms of reaching out to companies who we think are probably acutely affected by tariffs. That will be companies that are in the steel, aluminum, those kind of sectors. But I think maybe for me, the posture that I take will be a little bit different. So a lot of our companies around the world, FDI companies, are, I think, between a rock and a hard place. And I think for us to be effective as a state, my posture will be starting with a little bit of that empathetic message of, this is a hard thing for you to go through, and you're feeling pressure to invest, or maybe you're not really ready for it, or you can't really afford to go on if you don't. But we're going to offer you a safe and stable place to invest in. That's called Ohio. And let's get some information from you, and we'll see if we can't make a deal. So I don't know that this moment in time means that our communities need to start an inbound FDI program, but certainly know that at least at Team Neo, we're going to be ramping up ours a little bit more significantly, and at the same time making sure that our BREs are covering these topics in a serious way. Deb, how about you?
Yeah, I would just say that our locals are truly focused on BREs. We're doing a significant amount of those already. 42% of our of the Columbus region's pipeline is international companies already. That's a high number to begin with. We think that will continue. We're going to target, like Mindy, those industries and countries where we think are going to be impacted and have the most impact for us. I will say, in addition to doing your BREs, the best thing that communities can do is to be prepared for hosting clients when they come in. Understand your sites, understand your inventory of buildings, understand what those electric, gas, water capacities are. Be prepared so when it comes to you, you can put your best foot forward in showing that company why you're the best location.
I have one last question that I'm going to pose for a quick answer. I'll pose it because it's been asked a couple of times. There are a number of people interested specifically on the impact on commercial construction. With the level of development that's slated in many areas of Ohio, do these tariffs and labor shortages put any of those projects in jeopardy? Commercial construction versus residential.
I'll throw my opinion out. Absolutely. Depending on what the budget is for the client, if steel and aluminum costs are increasing, that's going to increase the overall cost of the project. If labor costs are increasing, or there are shortages, that also has impacts on the projects. So companies could either choose not to do as much of it because of the cost constraints, or not do it at all, or go over budget, but it will have an impact in one way or another.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a question to put a finer point on how absolutely important it is to have that new build happen. I don't know, maybe if you're talking about a hospital or something like that, where there's not a choice, they have to pay it because the community needs it, of course. But maybe if it's a Starbucks location and they're selling, even at a high hefty price for a cup of coffee or whatever Starbucks costs these days, that may not be a thing they can make up in the long run from a tariffed new cost construction. So as Deb said, it's going to really depend, and it's not an enviable position to be in commercial construction right now.
Okay, with that said, I'm going to turn the baton back over to David. David?
Okay, I just want to, Mark, I think we're wrapping this up, correct?
Yep, exactly right.
Okay, so I want to thank all of our distinguished panelists, Dan and Matt and Deb and Mindy. Thank you so much for giving your time to help move the profession, economic development forward, and those who are involved. I really, really appreciate your expertise. And I know I picked up a lot, learned a lot. Mark, thank you so much for what you do in leading our educational efforts. And I really want to thank the more than 100 participants we had. We really appreciate it. And we had some suggestions on maybe doing this later in the year, but any suggestions you have on topics, please let Mark or me know. With that, thank you so much, and have a great day and week, and keep moving Ohio's economy.
Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.